Welcome to this edition of Inside the Academy Studio.
Today's conversation will be about Ava DuVernay's Selma. Selma was written by Paul Webb, and it centers around the events leading to the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and especially the efforts by Martin Luther King, played by David Oyelowo, and his group, the SCLC, to change a discriminatory and, quite frankly, racist act in the deep south of America. The main opposition in this film is the state of Alabama and its cruel governor, George Wallace. The movie takes us through the ensuing months with negotiations with Lyndon Baines Johnson, and eventually to the world-famous march from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1967. This film, Selma, represents one of the few efforts made in Hollywood to portray Martin Luther King, now almost 50 years since he's passed. Obviously, he's such a huge figure in the history of modern American culture that you would expect more films to be made about Martin Luther King. Maybe we can speak upon why it's such a challenge to make a movie about MLK, and then specifically how we felt David Oyelowo, a British actor, did portraying this famous American civil rights leader.
Well, that's just because for a lot of American actors, I don't know if it's the only reason, but I think it's definitely consideration. It is a large role to fill, and it's going to come with huge expectations, and a ceiling that is nigh unreachable, versus a situation that David Oyelowo was put into was, he's playing Martin Luther King, but it's not just a Martin Luther King movie. This is a movie about there's a specific time in the movement. So I think being a lot more focused helped get this script pushed and made into the movie that we're seeing nominated for Best Picture right now.
And it's not to say that this was an easy film to make, because this was a project that had taken several years, attached with very different directors before Ava DuVernay came across. The only constant has been David Oyelowo. I think the fact that I think we both agree that Oyelowo does a great job here. It's not an identical representation of Martin Luther King, but you don't need to. He kind of captures the essence of MLK. And this is where I like the cross and co-examination that DuVernay and Oyelowo do about MLK. DuVernay came in, rewrote parts of the script to offer Oyelowo a unique kind of way to present MLK. You know, the speeches aren't identical. They're kind of tailored to this film. So you're not having Oyelowo recite "I Have a Dream" or more of the famous speeches made by Martin Luther King, but you're having him kind of portray his essence, that solitary figure fighting against civil rights. And I think that helps get a picture across like this. I know there's been other efforts in that the MLK family has traditionally not wanted portrayals, so that's part of why there haven't been films. But obviously, like you said, the focus is not on MLK as a biopic. It's about these specific events, and it helps kind of push the movie forward.
Yeah, and I think that relates to what the goal of the movie is it shows that ultimately that grassroots effort in Selma, Alabama, to get this march going so that they can really make a statement on the national level.
Exactly, and I think some of the better scenes in the film are those small group discussions that they have. It's like, how do you kind of, we always remember, okay, hey, it's MLK, he can just walk into the White House. He couldn't do that. He needed strategy, and that group of the SCLC and the student group led by John Lewis, they had to kind of develop a strategy of how do we want to approach this. There was a right way, they felt, and there was a wrong way, and it was a tricky balance to capture. Those were some of the finer moments I felt in the film. Obviously, Selma received a Best Picture nomination this year to go along with a Best Original Song. Some expected more. Some are obviously pleased with the recognition. DuVernay is a African American woman directing this film, a huge accomplishment in today's Hollywood. Period. How do you feel she handled portraying such a difficult character? It's such a bigger than life character. Can you talk about her job as a director?
Well, I think her job is obviously to get the most out of the actors on screen. This is definitely an ensemble piece in many ways, so having the right chemistry in scenes large and small was definitely very important. And I think a scene that really encapsulates that is when MLK and the rest of his SCLC team first arrive in Selma. And to be honest, I'm not too familiar with the history. I'll put that out there. And it may have been a fictionalization. It's a scene where a male white patron at the hotel approaches Martin Luther King and punches him in the face. And it's that moment where they realize, okay, there's something that needs to be done here, and Selma is the perfect way to show that message. Now, that scene may have been a fictionalization, but that scene with the characters involved helped to get the point across of what the situation really was in the U.S. at the time. And ultimately, I think that's a goal of a movie like this, is not necessarily to tell the story verbatim. You can always watch documentaries and read up articles in the past, but to really capture the essence of the time.
No, I agree. And DuVernay is someone who's, I think the funny thing about this film, it's an independent film, but it's an independent film that feels like a studio film. A lot of the promotional material felt such like a bigger film. DuVernay had worked on smaller films, most notably Middle of Nowhere, and she kind of very effortlessly eases into presenting such a biopic, such a huge feeling film, but still shot very intimately. I know you said you're not particularly familiar with the history, but history has been an important part of, I guess, at least the post-film process. It almost seems yearly now that every film has to have some sort of controversy, and this was the controversy developed by LBJ not being sympathetic enough or being portrayed as sympathetic enough. Do you feel that, one, DuVernay and her team had any right or any responsibility to kind of portray this film through the perspective of the presidency here? Because obviously, to me, it didn't look like this was a film about the presidency. It wasn't a film about the Alabama governorship and what George Wallace did. It was more of the inner workings of the SCLC and the student group and how that relationship happened. Is that kind of reason that you don't need to kind of say, hey, okay, so we didn't make LBJ a three-dimensional character in any sense, or in some senses?
Yeah, and I think it was kind of LBJ's character is kind of what you lose when you're making a movie focus on more of the SCLC. Essentially, his character combines and his focus on, okay, I don't want to focus on the segregation right now, I want to focus on the poverty. It's not necessarily what LBJ thought himself, but I think it's more of what the entire administration thought and what people around LBJ were saying. And in the movie, LBJ becomes the device where you hear those thoughts from. So it may very well be a mischaracterization of what the real LBJ is, but once again, like I said before, it's probably not a mischaracterization of how difficult it was to convince the federal government to support their cause.
Yeah, exactly. It showed an LBJ who had different priorities, but I don't think it was in any way abhorrently offensive to his legacy. There's obviously this. It's not a documentary. It's a piece of fiction that has historical elements to it. So there's going to be elements that not everybody agrees to. Anything you'd like to discuss about Selma?
I think one thing I really liked about this movie, or at least I found interesting, was there were a lot of when they're introducing characters, there's a lot of scenes where you just see them being introduced and what they're kind of subjected to. And one most notably is a scene where I forgot what's her name, the character that Oprah Winfrey plays.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but I can look that up while you keep talking.
Yeah, so that's also a good scene where it shows something that's is not really talked about today. I mean, voting.
Annie Lee Cooper.
Yeah. Yeah, so Annie Lee Cooper. So voting is something that is not really considered that much of an issue today, even just 50 years later. But then it showed like all the difficulty that they had to go through at that time.
No, exactly. It was a good tone set. There's two scenes that set the tone. Obviously, the bombing in the church and the voting protest made by Annie Lee Cooper, Oprah Winfrey's character. Quickly, let's talk about the second nomination, Glory, Best Original Song by Common and John Legend. It is a song that's kind of become the anchoring point of this film and how it's being, spread to the masses. Quickly, your impressions of the song.
Well, it's definitely a good song, and I think the reason why it's getting so much play, especially that big performance at those very strange Grammys, but it's a good performance nonetheless, is because most of the themes covered in the song are relevant today. With, of course, the protesting you're seeing in Ferguson and the problems we're seeing at race relations even today.
And that's obviously a concerted effort by Common to relate the actions of 65 to 2014. We're nearing the end of this episode of Inside the Academy Studio, and always we like to end with certain questions. So I ask, what was your favorite moment in Selma?
And my favorite moment was a scene that we just recently brought up. I guess it wasn't my favorite moment to view, but it really put me into the right mindset for the rest of the movie, was that bombing at the Birmingham church. And because, like I mentioned before, I wasn't familiar at all with Selma. Obviously, I knew Martin Luther King is important in the civil rights movement, and I have a dream in that, but I did not know how much was done in the state of Alabama, and how much the tensions really were that high that there were acts of like paramilitary actions by white supremacist groups that were really drawing such a big divide at that time, and how difficult it was for the group like the SCLC to really get their point across.
Similarly, my favorite scene was also an emotional gut punch. It was when, at this point, Martin Luther King was not in Selma, and some protesters were marching at night, and the governor sent an extra policeman, and the policeman obviously, took power to their head, and it led to the untimely death of a young man who was in the accompaniment of his mother and grandfather. And when Martin Luther King finally comes to the hospital, sees the boy dead, talks to the grandfather, and the grandfather, just plainly says, I was born in the late 1800s, and my grandson said, hey, maybe I'll get a chance to vote. And that kind of put it into perspective of how long some people had to suffer just for the sake of, to carry their head up high, to get that respect that they deserved. It was a fantastic scene. Okay, least favorite moment. My least favorite moment is more, I guess, how the film is constructed. I know it's something that pushes the narrative across, but I didn't like that FBI rating that always popped up. In many ways, it was distracting, amateurish almost. I could have used less of that throughout the film, because I think we had enough. The script worked well enough that you were never lost at any point. It was pretty point A to point B story. So to have, that background descriptions kind of keep popping up, to me, I found it a little distracting.
And my least favorite scene in the movie is the inclusion of Malcolm X. There's a brief scene where he speaks to King's family, and just talks about how he lends his support. And it's brought up briefly, and then it's kind of dropped soon after, mainly because Malcolm X soon died after anyway. But I can understand Malcolm X is an important figure at this time as well, but I didn't really see his relation to how focused the story is on specifically the Selma March.
Okay, the final thing we like to do is word association. So when you think Selma, what word do you think of?
March.
And I think of bridge, specifically the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So when we think of Selma, we think of March and bridge. Thank you for listening to this edition of Inside the Academy Studio.
Thank you.